moment the reports surfaced, a single question cut through the noise of the war. What does it mean when a traditionally cautious Nordic state signals that it is ready to fundamentally alter Ukraine's air war? In early February 2025, discussions between senior defense officials from Sweden and Ukraine revealed preparations for one of the most consequential military support packages since the conflict began, and the implications reached far beyond routine aid. This was not just about replacing expended equipment or plugging short-term gaps. It was about shifting the geometry of the battlefield in a way Moscow has worked hard to prevent. For months, Russia had relied on a brutal but effective Formula aircraft, operating safely behind the front lines, releasing glide bombs and cruise missiles from distances that kept pilots largely out of danger. Cities, power infrastructure, and defensive positions paid the price. Ukraine adapted with drones, dispersed air defenses, and electronic warfare, but the imbalance in the air remained a persistent vulnerability. Against that backdrop, Sweden's move landed with the force of a strategic shock. The symbolism alone mattered. A country that joined NATO only recently was now positioning itself as a central architect of Ukraine's future military capabilities. What made the moment especially striking was timing. The war had entered a phase where incremental changes no longer delivered decisive results. Both sides were searching for qualitative edges rather than numerical ones. Russia accelerated missile and drone production, betting on saturation and endurance. Ukraine, supported by Western partners, focused on precision integration and long-range reach. Sweden's intervention appeared designed to reinforce that second approach, signaling that the next phase of the war would be fought with smarter, more interconnected systems rather than sheer volume. The initial headlines hinted at something even more unsettling for Moscow: the possibility that Ukraine could eventually gain access to one of Europe's most advanced air-to-air weapons. Even before any confirmation, the mere discussion was enough to trigger alarm. Russian military doctrine has long depended on controlling escalation in the air domain, carefully managing the risk to its aircraft, while maximizing pressure on Ukrainian defenses. The introduction of a weapon capable of threatening aircraft far from the front would undermine that doctrine at its core. Yet the shock was not limited to the weapon itself. Sweden's broader posture suggested a deeper commitment to shaping Ukraine's long-term military trajectory. This was about building capacity, not just delivering hardware. Industrial cooperation, joint development programs, and integration with Western systems all pointed toward a future in which Ukraine would no longer fight with a patchwork of legacy equipment and emergency donations. Instead, it would operate as a modern force aligned with NATO standards, capable of deterring and defeating threats well beyond its borders. For European security, the message was equally loud. Sweden's move challenged the assumption that only a handful of major powers drive strategic change. Smaller but technologically advanced states could play outsized roles by delivering the right capabilities at the right moment. In doing so, they also signaled resolve to allies and adversaries alike. For NATO, this was a preview of a more distributed leadership model where regional players take initiative rather than waiting for direction from Washington or Brussels. Russia, meanwhile, faced an uncomfortable reality. Its window to exploit Ukrainian weaknesses in the air might be closing. Even the prospect of future capabilities forced planners to reconsider flight profiles, basing decisions, and the sustainability of current tactics. Adjustments would cost time and resources both in short supply as the war dragged on and sanctions continued to bite. Psychological impact mattered too. The uncertainty created by potential new threats can be as disruptive as their actual deployment. As February 2025 unfolded, one thing became clear: Sweden's signal was not a footnote, but a warning flare. It suggested that the next surprises in the war would not come from sheer escalation, but from carefully calibrated technological leaps designed to reshape how the conflict is fought. The question now was not whether this move would provoke a reaction, but how quickly the ripple effects would spread across the battlefield and the broader geopolitical landscape. Would this northern shock mark the beginning of a decisive shift in Ukraine's favor, or merely trigger another round of adaptation in an already brutal cycle? What followed the initial shock was a clearer picture of Sweden's broader military package, and it quickly became evident that the real story extended far beyond any single headline weapon. The planned support focused on systems that address Ukraine's most urgent operational needs, while laying the groundwork for long-term resilience. Air defense, surveillance, electronic warfare, and unmanned systems formed the backbone of this effort, reflecting lessons learned from 3 years of high-intensity conflict. At the center of the package were advanced air defense components and radar systems designed to improve detection, tracking, and interception. Ukraine's biggest challenge has never been a lack of courage or tactical ingenuity, but the sheer volume and diversity of threats it faces. Ballistic missiles, cruise missiles, drones, and guided bombs arrive from different vectors and altitudes, often simultaneously. Modern radar coverage is essential for stitching together a coherent air picture, allowing defenders to prioritize targets and conserve scarce interceptors. Sweden's contribution in this area promised not just additional hardware, but better integration with existing Western-supplied systems, reducing response times and improving overall effectiveness. Equally significant was the emphasis on electronic warfare. Russia has invested heavily in jamming, spoofing, and disrupting communications, seeking to blind Ukrainian forces and degrade precision strikes. Sweden's experience in this domain is widely regarded as among the most sophisticated in Europe. By supplying electronic warfare systems and supporting domestic Ukrainian development, Stockholm signaled an understanding that control of the electromagnetic spectrum is now as decisive as control of the skies. These tools can disrupt enemy drones, interfere with missile guidance, and protect friendly forces, often without a single shot being fired. Unmanned aerial vehicles formed another critical pillar. Ukraine has already demonstrated how low-cost drones can deliver outsized strategic effects, striking refineries, logistics hubs, and command centers deep behind enemy lines. In 2025, these operations increasingly targeted the economic foundations of Russia's war effort, forcing repairs, rerouting, and costly defensive measures. Sweden's support aimed to expand this capability through either direct provision or funding for domestic production, ensuring that Ukraine retains the ability to conduct long-range precision strikes despite constant adaptation by Russian defenses. What set this package apart, however, was its industrial dimension. Rather than treating Ukraine as a passive recipient of aid, Sweden positioned it as a partner in production and innovation. Support for Ukraine's defense industrial base promised faster repair cycles, localized manufacturing, and the ability to adapt systems based on real-time battlefield feedback. This approach addresses one of the West's chronic problems: slow procurement timelines that struggle to keep pace with wartime demand. By enabling production closer to the front, Sweden helped shorten the loop between design deployment and improvement. The package also hinted at future pathways for addressing ballistic missile threats, an area where Ukraine remains stretched thin. Discussions around cooperative initiatives designed to pool resources and prioritize Ukraine's most urgent requirements suggested a more coordinated Western approach. Instead of fragmented donations, this model focuses on delivering what is most needed when it is needed based on evolving threat assessments. For Ukraine, that could mean more consistent access to high-end interceptors and supporting infrastructure. Strategically, Sweden's comprehensive package reflected a shift in Western thinking. The goal was no longer merely to help Ukraine survive, but to help it contest and shape the battle space. Each element of the package reinforced the others. Better radar improves air defense effectiveness. Electronic warfare protects drones and missiles. Domestic production sustains long-term operations. Together, they form a system of systems approach that complicates Russian planning at every level. For Moscow, this integration was deeply troubling. Russia has shown an ability to adapt to individual systems, developing countermeasures and workarounds over time. Integrated networks are far harder to neutralize. They force adversaries to confront multiple layers of defense and offense, simultaneously increasing costs and reducing operational freedom. As Sweden's plans became clearer, so did the realization that Ukraine's military was being reshaped into a far more formidable force than it had been at the start of the war. The open question was how quickly these capabilities could be fielded and whether Russia could disrupt their deployment before they made a decisive difference. Would Sweden's holistic approach accelerate Ukraine's transformation fast enough to blunt the next wave of attacks, or would delays and countermeasures limit its immediate impact? Among all the elements discussed in connection with Sweden's support, one weapon concept cast the longest shadow over Russian planning: the Meteor missile. Even without a confirmed transfer, the characteristics of this system explain why its name alone carries such weight. Designed for beyond visual range air combat, Meteor represents a class of weapons built not merely to shoot down enemy aircraft, but to fundamentally alter where and how they can operate. In a war where airspace control has remained contested but limited, that distinction matters enormously. Meteor's defining feature is not just range, but control throughout the engagement. Traditional air-to-air missiles rely heavily on a brief boost phase, followed by a predictable flight profile. Meteor, by contrast, uses a different propulsion concept that allows it to maintain high energy deep into its flight. For pilots on the receiving end, this translates into a much larger no-escape zone, meaning that once the missile is launched within a certain envelope, evasive maneuvers become largely ineffective. Speed altitude changes and electronic countermeasures offer little comfort when the missile retains the ability to adjust its trajectory and close distance aggressively. In practical terms, this capability targets one of Russia's key advantages. Russian aircraft launching guided bombs and cruise missiles typically operate from what planners consider relatively safe standoff distances. These tactics reduce exposure to Ukrainian air defenses while maximizing pressure on ground targets. A missile capable of threatening aircraft well before they release their payload would force a re-evaluation of this approach. Pilots would have to fly farther back, reduce sortie rates, or accept significantly higher risk, each option carrying operational and psychological costs. The missile's resilience in contested electronic environments further amplifies its impact. Modern air combat is no longer just about speed and range. It is about surviving in a spectrum saturated with jamming decoys and spoofing. Meteor was developed with these conditions in mind, combining onboard guidance with continuous updates that help it adapt to a dynamic battlespace. Against an adversary that prides itself on electronic warfare, this adaptability undermines a critical pillar of defense. From Ukraine's perspective, the significance lies in what Meteor would enable rather than what it would immediately destroy. The missile would not magically grant air superiority across the entire front. Instead, it would allow Ukraine to create localized zones of denial areas where Russian aircraft must think twice before entering. Even limited denial can have outsized effects. It complicates mission planning, disrupts timing, and forces reliance on less efficient alternatives. Over time, these frictions accumulate, degrading the overall effectiveness of air campaigns. There is also a broader symbolic dimension. Meteor is the product of European cooperation, reflecting a collective investment in advanced aerospace technology. Its potential transfer would signal a willingness among European states to move beyond incremental aid and provide Ukraine with tools that represent a qualitative leap. Such a signal carries deterrent value beyond the battlefield, reinforcing the idea that escalation in support is driven by strategic calculation rather than fear of retaliation. Critically, the discussion around Meteor highlights a shift in how military aid is framed. Instead of focusing solely on defensive needs, it acknowledges the importance of shaping enemy behavior. The threat of engagement can be as powerful as engagement itself. If Russian commanders must plan around the possibility of advanced air-to-air threats, their freedom of action narrows even if no missile is ever fired. At the same time, uncertainty remains. Integrating such a system requires compatible aircraft-trained crews and secure logistical chains. These challenges temper expectations and underscore that Meteor is not a silver bullet. Yet the very fact that these conversations are happening reflects a change in momentum. The debate is no longer about whether Ukraine should receive advanced capabilities, but about how and when. As 2025 progresses, the Meteor discussion serves as a case study in modern deterrence. It illustrates how technology, even in limited numbers, can reshape strategic calculations by altering perceived risk. The unresolved question is whether this potential will be realized quickly enough to influence the current phase of the war, or whether it will remain a looming factor shaping decisions on both sides well into the future. To understand why advanced air-to-air capabilities matter so much, it is necessary to examine the threat Ukraine faces from above. Russia's air campaign has evolved into a grim rhythm of standoff attacks designed to exploit distance and volume. Guided aerial bombs, cruise missiles, and waves of drones are launched in patterns intended to overwhelm defenses and exhaust interceptors. This approach minimizes risk to pilots while maximizing pressure on Ukrainian cities and frontline positions, creating a persistent sense of vulnerability, even far from active combat zones. In recent months, the scale of these attacks has underscored their strategic intent. Russia has relied heavily on converted dumb bombs fitted with guidance kits, turning aging stockpiles into relatively accurate standoff weapons. Dropped from aircraft operating beyond the reach of many Ukrainian systems, these munitions have devastated infrastructure and defensive lines alike. Their effectiveness lies not only in precision, but in numbers. Large salvos force defenders to make difficult choices about what to intercept and what to absorb, steadily wearing down limited resources. Ukraine's response has been adaptive, but constrained. Domestic drone production has enabled long-range strikes against Russian logistics and energy infrastructure, demonstrating that distance cuts both ways. By hitting refineries and depots deep inside Russian territory, Ukraine has imposed economic and operational costs that ripple through the war effort. Yet these strikes, while strategically valuable, do not directly neutralize aircraft in flight. The gap between ground-based defenses and airborne threats remains a critical challenge. This is where the prospect of advanced Western systems becomes transformative. By threatening the platforms that deliver guided bombs rather than the bombs themselves, Ukraine could shift the cost-benefit calculus for Russia. Each aircraft lost represents not just a single mission disrupted, but a long-term reduction in capacity. Training new crews, repairing or replacing airframes, and adjusting tactics all impose burdens that accumulate over time. Even a small increase in perceived risk can lead to more conservative operational choices, reducing the intensity and frequency of attacks. Russia's reliance on electronic warfare and navigation-resistant guidance reflects its own learning curve. By hardening guidance systems against jamming and integrating inertial navigation, Russian planners have sought to preserve strike effectiveness in a contested environment. These adaptations complicate Ukrainian defenses and highlight the technological arms race unfolding above the battlefield. Any Western response must therefore account for resilience, not just raw performance. The interplay between offense and defense extends beyond Ukraine's borders. Russia's air campaign has implications for regional security, as flight profiles and missile trajectories often pass close to NATO airspace. Incidents involving drones and missiles straying across borders have heightened anxiety among neighboring states. Strengthening Ukraine's ability to contest airspace thus serves a dual purpose, protecting Ukrainian territory and reinforcing the security of the wider region. From a strategic perspective, disrupting Russia's aerial threat would also affect ground operations. Air-delivered munitions play a crucial role in softening defenses and supporting advances. If their effectiveness is reduced, pressure shifts back to artillery and ground assaults, both of which carry higher costs and slower tempos. This dynamic could influence the overall trajectory of the conflict, potentially creating openings for diplomatic or military initiatives. Yet expectations must remain grounded. No single system will neutralize the air threat overnight. Integration challenges, limited numbers, and the constant evolution of countermeasures ensure that progress will be incremental. The real value lies in changing trends rather than delivering immediate victories. By steadily raising the risks associated with aerial attacks, Ukraine and its partners can erode one of Russia's most potent tools. As the air war intensifies, the question becomes whether Ukraine can close the gap quickly enough to protect its population and forces from the next wave of strikes. Will the combination of Western technology and Ukrainian innovation finally tilt the balance in the skies? Or will Russia find new ways to adapt and sustain its campaign from a distance? The discussion around advanced missiles inevitably leads to the platforms required to launch them, and here the focus shifts to a fighter aircraft that has long occupied a unique niche in European defense planning. The potential pathway toward integrating modern Western airframes into Ukraine's air force represents more than a procurement decision. It signals a strategic transformation that could redefine Ukraine's military posture for decades. This transformation is not about replacing one aircraft with another, but about embedding Ukraine into a Western ecosystem of training, maintenance, and operational doctrine. Modern fighter aircraft are force multipliers precisely because they integrate seamlessly with sensors, data links, and weapons. For Ukraine, whose air force still relies heavily on upgraded Soviet-era designs, this integration gap has been a persistent limitation. Western aircraft bring not only superior avionics and survivability, but also compatibility with a wide array of advanced munitions and networked systems. The shift would allow Ukrainian pilots to operate within a battlespace shaped by shared situational awareness rather than isolated engagements. From a strategic standpoint, the gradual introduction of such aircraft would change how Russia perceives escalation. Moscow has long calibrated its actions based on assumptions about Ukrainian capabilities, pushing limits where it believed the risk was manageable. A modernized Ukrainian air force complicates that calculus. It introduces uncertainty about detection ranges, engagement envelopes, and response times. Even before reaching full operational strength, the transition itself forces Russia to plan for a more dangerous adversary. The long-term implications extend beyond immediate combat effectiveness. Training pipelines, maintenance facilities, and localized production all contribute to sustainability. Discussions about future industrial cooperation suggest a model in which Ukraine is not perpetually dependent on external deliveries, but increasingly capable of supporting its own fleet. This autonomy matters in a protracted conflict, where supply chains are vulnerable to political shifts and logistical bottlenecks. For NATO and European security, Ukraine's transformation carries broader significance. A capable Ukrainian air force aligned with Western standards enhances collective deterrence along the alliance's eastern flank. It also distributes the burden of regional security, reducing pressure on neighboring states to compensate for gaps. In this sense, supporting Ukraine's air modernization is an investment in long-term stability rather than a one-off response to crisis. However, challenges remain substantial. Transitioning to new aircraft requires time, resources, and sustained political commitment. Pilots must retrain, ground crews must master unfamiliar systems, and infrastructure must be adapted. These processes cannot be rushed without risking accidents or reduced effectiveness. Moreover, any visible progress invites countermeasures, from intensified strikes on air bases to diplomatic pressure aimed at slowing transfers. Despite these obstacles, momentum appears to be building. Statements from Ukrainian leadership and European partners suggest an understanding that partial measures are no longer sufficient. The war has demonstrated that outdated assumptions about escalation and restraint often benefit the aggressor. By contrast, clear signals of long-term support can stabilize expectations and deter reckless moves. The strategic transformation underway is therefore as much psychological as material. It communicates confidence in Ukraine's future as a security provider rather than a permanent security consumer. For Russia, this is perhaps the most unsettling message of all. It implies that even if the current phase of the war drags on, the balance of power is shifting in ways that will outlast any single campaign. As these plans move from concept to reality, the key question is whether the transition can be managed quickly enough to influence near-term outcomes while remaining sustainable in the long run. Will Ukraine's evolving air power arrive in time to reshape the battlefield, or will its greatest impact be felt in the post-war security order taking shape across Europe as Sweden's initiatives and Ukraine's potential air transformation come into focus? The broader geopolitical consequences become impossible to ignore. What began as a bilateral discussion over military assistance now reverberates across NATO, the United States, and the wider Western alliance. The implications stretch far beyond Ukraine's airspace, touching on deterrence theory, alliance cohesion, and the evolving nature of modern warfare in 2025. At the strategic level, these developments signal a shift in how the West approaches long-term conflict management. Earlier phases of the war were dominated by caution, incrementalism, and fears of escalation. Advanced capabilities were delivered slowly, often after months of debate. The current trajectory suggests a different mindset, shaping the battlefield proactively rather than reacting to crises. By supporting Ukraine with systems that alter adversary behavior, Western partners demonstrate a willingness to accept calculated risk in exchange for strategic leverage. For NATO, this approach reinforces collective deterrence. A Ukraine capable of contesting airspace and striking high-value targets complicates Russian military planning, not only within Ukraine, but along the alliance's eastern frontier. It reduces the likelihood that Moscow can localize the conflict or intimidate neighboring states through demonstrations of air power. In effect, Ukraine becomes a forward buffer that absorbs and deflects pressure that might otherwise test NATO's resolve directly. The United States plays a critical, if sometimes understated, role in this framework. By coordinating prioritization mechanisms and encouraging allies to step forward with advanced contributions, Washington amplifies the impact of European initiatives. This burden-sharing dynamic strengthens alliance cohesion at a time when global attention is divided among multiple flashpoints from the Middle East to the Indo-Pacific. It also sends a signal to other potential adversaries that prolonged aggression will trigger not fatigue, but deeper integration among opponents. From Moscow's perspective, the trend is deeply unsettling. Russia's strategy has relied on endurance and the assumption that Western unity would erode over time. Instead, the opposite appears to be happening. As the war grinds on, support becomes more structured, more strategic, and more focused on long-term outcomes. The psychological effect of this shift should not be underestimated. Wars are fought not only with weapons, but with expectations about the future. When those expectations turn bleak, decision-making narrows. The implications extend to global security norms as well. The integration of advanced systems, industrial cooperation, and networked warfare highlights how conflicts between states increasingly resemble competitions between ecosystems rather than isolated militaries. Success depends on logistics, technology training, and political alignment as much as battlefield tactics. Ukraine's evolution, supported by partners like Sweden, offers a case study in how smaller states can leverage alliances to offset numerical disadvantages. Yet uncertainty remains. Russia will adapt, seeking asymmetric responses and alternative pressure points. The risk of miscalculation persists, especially as more advanced capabilities enter the theater. Managing escalation while maintaining resolve will remain a delicate balancing act for Western policymakers. The challenge is to ensure that deterrence is strengthened without closing off avenues for de-escalation when opportunities arise. As 2025 unfolds, the choices made now will shape not only the outcome of the current war, but the security architecture of Europe for a generation. Sweden's actions, Ukraine's transformation, and NATO's response together form a test of whether collective security can adapt to prolonged high-intensity conflict. The final question is one of direction and commitment. Will the West sustain this momentum long enough to secure a stable peace? And will audiences continue to engage, follow, and support these critical developments, shaping the future of global security?